Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 430. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got quite a bit of news to talk about on today's show, so I just want to remind you all to share the show, and then we'll get into it. You can find the show at the Libertarian Institute, on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show, and it's up anywhere you can listen to podcasts. Now let's get into today's show. First article up here about Julian Assange from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Dave writes here, FBI looking to gather new information about Julian Assange. The Sydney Morning Herald reported on Thursday that the FBI is looking to gather new information about Julian Assange. According to a front page story, the FBI may be trying to build its case against Assange, who was indicted by the U.S. Justice Department in 2019 for exposing U.S. war crimes by publishing classified documents he obtained from a source, a standard journalistic practice. The report said last week that FBI contacted Andrew O'Hagan, a Scottish novelist who worked as a ghostwriter for Assange's autobiography. O'Hagan rejected the FBI's request as he opposes the U.S. efforts to imprison Assange for his journalism. And this is a statement from O'Hagan. I would not give a witness statement against a fellow journalist being pursued for telling the truth. I would happily go to jail before agreeing in any way to support the American security established in its cynical effort. So, very brave statement there because, as we've seen with Chelsea Manning, they will throw people in jail for not being involved in their prosecution of Assange. Assange's legal team was surprised by the FBI request, which came amid building pressure on the Biden administration to drop the charges against the WikiLeaks founder. A delegation of Australian lawmakers recently met with the U.S. ambassador of Australia and called on Washington to free Assange, who has been held in the London Belmarsh prison since the indictment, and I believe that's been over 4 years now. It's just a massive amount of time when you consider that for almost a decade prior to that, he was trapped in the Ecuadorian embassy. So, this man's been essentially in different levels of prisons for over the past decade. And with this prison in Belmarsh being extremely harsh. Stephen Kenny, Assange's Australian lawyer, said it appears they are continuing to try to investigate, which I find unusual given the amount of time that has passed since the investigation began. I would think it is of some concern because we have been working to try to secure an arrangement that would see Julian come home. It would be very unusual if the FBI was working to gather evidence that could help clear his name. Assange's brother, Gabriel Shipton, said it appears that the U.S. might be seeking a new indictment against Assange that it showed some acknowledgement of its weak charges against him. And so the Biden administration has already been pressured by Rashid Tlaib, the congresswoman from Michigan, who got a group together and they sent a letter to the attorney general demanding that these charges be dropped. All right, next up here, I have a write-up from Dave DeCamp on a story that I briefly discussed on the show last week. And the reason I discussed it last week is I felt like there was a false narrative going around in the independent media saying that Javelin and AT-4 anti-armor rockets, missiles from Ukraine had ended up in the hands of the Mexican cartel. And there's some evidence that they did have access to an AT-4 system. However, this doesn't seem to be as conclusive that this came from Ukraine, and certainly that this isn't a Javelin missile, which is a far more advanced piece of equipment and far more, be concerning, I would think, if that ended up in Mexico. So Mexican TV spots anti-tank missile launcher that has been sent to Ukraine in the hands of cartel. Mexican TV has reported that a militant affiliated with Mexico's Gulf cartel was spotted carrying an advanced rocket launcher the same time that the U.S. has shipped thousands of to Ukraine. A news anchor for a Mexican TV network identified the rocket launcher as Raytheon-made Javelin anti-tank missile system, which the U.S. has been providing to Ukraine since 2018. Over 10,000 Javelins have poured into Ukraine since its invasion last year. Some online observers have said that the launcher showed on TV looks more like a Swedish-made AT-4 anti-armor system, which has also been shipped to Ukraine. The main difference between the two anti-tank systems is that the Javelin fires guided missiles while the AT-4 munition and other is unguided, and the AT-4 is meant for just one use. So to me, it does look pretty clearly here like an AT-4. I believe the Javelins are much larger. So it is interesting. Now, I would say that even if the, this particular rocket launcher didn't come from Ukraine, it didn't make a stop in Ukraine before coming back to Mexico, we can look at just the proliferation of arms in Ukraine, the fact that we know that those arms have leaked out to Finland, to Africa, that the global weapons market is just, has more supply, which means it's going to be easier for different groups to get their hands on more advanced weapons if there's more of them on the black market. And so I'm sure in some way the war in Ukraine has had an impact on this, even if this particular AT-4 didn't come from Ukraine. And so I just want to, go through that and make sure that, we're being somewhat careful of how we talk about this. Again, not that the U.S. Army in Ukraine couldn't have led to this, that this certainly could be a weapon from Ukraine. However, just be careful about definitively saying it. And then also, what weapon system is what, because there is a difference between Javelin and AT-4. All right. So it looks like the Ukrainian counteroffensive is underway. Russia says Ukraine launched a large-scale offensive. We had a statement from Zelensky yesterday saying that the forces were ready. Not necessarily saying that the counteroffensive was underway, just that everybody was ready. And so Zelensky saying that, plus the fact that we've had the Ukrainian Defense Ministry come out and say that we don't want a whole lot of commentary right now because we are about to launch this counteroffensive. I think it's probably going on. So the Russian Defense Ministry said early Monday that Ukraine began a large-scale offensive by launching attacks along 5 sections of the front lines of the eastern Donbass region. According to RT, the ministry said the offensive began early Sunday and the Ukrainian forces were unsuccessful. The enemy goal was to breach our defenses in what was assumed was the most vulnerable section of the front line, the ministry said in a statement. The enemy has failed to reach its goal and was unsuccessful. The statement said the ministry claimed that Ukraine lost 250 soldiers, 16 tanks, 3 infantry vehicles, 21 armored vehicles, but those numbers aren't confirmed. The statement from the Russian Defense Ministry came after much anticipation of Ukraine's long-awaited counteroffensive. And just before I went on, which is a couple hours after Dave put out this article, I did go and look at some different sites that do tend to cover the war somewhat accurately day to day. And it does look to me that there were significant military operations carried out by Ukraine yesterday, and that for the most part, they didn't take any territory. Now, it's important to say that we have to see what's going on with this counteroffensive a couple days down the line, weeks down the line, to really see how effective it's going to be. Remember, the last time Ukraine launched a counteroffensive, they used a feint maneuver. They attacked in a different region, the region everybody thought they were going to attack. But then what they actually did was attack in a different region, were able to retake some territory. And so maybe we'll see something similar here where, these initial maneuvers, that's not the case. At the same time, I'm not sure that's what's going on here. There's a couple reasons for it. One, I'm sure Russia is somewhat anticipating it, so they're probably looking at carrying out something different. But also, let's see. Let me find this article that I wrote yesterday. All right, so this piece right here, they've identified one of the battalions, the Washington Post did, that is apparently going to serve the tip of the spear here. And so my guess is that as long as Russia's, essentially able to identify where the 47th Separatist Mechanized Brigade is on the battlefield, the Washington Post seems to be indicating that that's where the counteroffensive is going to take place. So I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute yesterday. NATO trained armed soldiers will lead Ukraine's counteroffensive. Ukrainian soldiers trained by NATO and armed with Western weapons will serve as the tip of the spear. That's a quote, tip of the spear, during the upcoming counteroffensive against Russian forces, according to the Washington Post. The Ukrainian defense minister said the support represents the next level of security assistance. Kiev's 47th Mechanized Brigade has spent months training in Germany to use Western-made weapons and tactics on the battlefield. The soldiers spend a significant amount of time in the classroom learning on simulations. The brigade will be armed almost entirely with Western weapons. You understand the overall picture and how it works. The major who is in charge of this brigade said, you understand where your shortcomings were and what we pay attention to, what we failed to do during this simulation. The Ukrainian defense minister described the support from NATO as the next level of security assistance. Whole Ukrainian units have been sent to Germany and other countries to learn how to operate simultaneously together, like interoperability along the different units, he said. So that's the Ukrainian defense minister. While some soldiers received advanced training and weapons outside of Ukraine, Kiev deployed poorly trained and armed troops to the battlefield in Bakhmut. The Wall Street Journal reported that they spoke with a group of Ukrainian soldiers last month who described the troops in Bakhmut as mostly poor men from villages in northeastern Kharkiv region, many of them unemployed, doing odd jobs as handyman or shift workers at factories in the regional capital. And so this is interesting because I didn't put this in my piece, but in the Washington Post article, they went through and they said to get into the 47th Mechanized Brigade, you had to go through a vetting process. And so it would be kind of interesting if, if you're a well-connected Ukrainian and your kid gets conscripted or, they end up in conflict, if you're able to somehow get them to be the soldiers that end up going out of the country to train versus the ones being sent to the Bakhmut front lines, which was, described by so many people as a meat grinder. So according to a soldier who received training in Germany, the Western instructors were only concerned about attacking. While training in Germany earlier this year, the 29-year-old company commander told the Washington Post the main tasks that were played were the offensive, were only going on the offensive. The Washington Post notes that the Western tactics may be ineffective for Ukrainian forces as Kiev lacks modern fighter jets needed to make the strategy work. Washington and its allies are developing a program to train Ukrainian pilots on F-16s and transfer them to Kiev. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, said on Thursday that F-16s and Abrams tanks will be unavailable to Kiev for the counteroffensive. I think that Abrams just recently arrived in Germany and they're looking at a 10-week training period. Initially, I thought they were eyeing October to get them to the battlefield, but it'll probably be sometime before October if their timelines are at all accurate. And then I guess too will depend what's going on tactically at that time in Ukraine. Do you want to send in those Abrams? Do you want to leave them outside of the country until you're preparing another counteroffensive or something like that? Because, the U.S. and the Ukrainians have said now that this won't be the last counteroffensive. The U.S. and its allies have preparing Ukraine to launch the counteroffensive for several months, at least since February. However, documents released through the Discord leaks and statements from Ukrainian officials show Washington and Kiev are pessimistic that the operations will be a success. And so, this is going to be bad for Ukraine if this counteroffensive does not work out. And if the first day are any indication, it doesn't seem to be going particularly well. Now, I want to talk about this article that I think is really important. I think it's one of the more important articles that I've written in some time covering news stuff. This title, Blinken dismisses calls for a ceasefire, says U.S. must build up Ukraine's military. And In this article, I cover a speech that Blinken gave in Finland, and I think it was a fairly significant speech. And so let's just get into it. The U.S. will focus its efforts on arming Ukraine and not attempting to bring the war to a negotiated settlement, America's top diplomat said. Secretary of State Antony Blinken laid out a plan to massively expand Kiev's military before talks begin. In his speech delivered in Finland on Friday, Blinken stated the United States, together with our allies and partners, is firmly committed to supporting Ukraine's defense today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes. We believe the prerequisite for meaningful diplomacy and real peace is a stronger Ukraine capable of deterring and defending against any future aggression. Blinken dismissed the idea of even a temporary pause in the fighting. He said, some countries will call for a ceasefire. And on the surface, that sounds sensible, attractive even. After all, who doesn't want warring parties to lay down their arms? Who doesn't want to stop the killing? But a ceasefire that simply freezes current lines in place and enables Putin to consolidate control over the territory he's seized, it will legitimize the Russian land grab, it will reward the aggressor, and punish the victim. And so he's basically saying that this is crazy because he's saying, after all, who doesn't want the warring parties to lay down their arms? Who doesn't want the killings to stop? And he says, I don't. Right? Like that's what he's saying here. Now, I think we get some hints as to why later on in his speech, and I'll get into that. The Secretary of State offered an ambitious vision of Kiev's future military capabilities. America and our allies are helping meet Ukraine's needs on the current battlefield while developing a force that can deter and defend against aggression for years to come. That means helping build a Ukrainian military of the future with long-term funding, a strong air force centered on modern combat aircraft, an integrated air and missile defense network, advanced tanks and armored vehicles, national capacity to produce ammunition, and the training and support to keep forces and equipment combat ready. And so that's, I think, a fairly significant statement. He's saying that before this war ends, what they want to do is make sure that Ukraine has a military of the future that includes modern combat aircraft, so at least a fleet of F-16s, integrated air and missile defense network. And look, I'm sure Russia is going to read that as including the Aegis Ashore system, which of course Russia has a massive issue with because the launchers for the Aegis Ashore can also be used to fire nuclear-tipped Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are a strategic threat to Moscow, particularly if those missiles are deployed in Eastern Europe, and then especially if they're deployed to Ukraine. And so whenever the U.S. typically talks about layered air defenses, the Aegis Ashore, the THAAD, the Iron Dome, the Patriot, there's a few more systems that are part of that layered defense. And so, the way Blinken says this, I'm sure that's how Ukraine or Russia is going to read it. He also says advanced tanks, armored vehicles, and then also helping Ukraine to produce their own ammunition. And all these things, I think, are going to be read by the Kremlin as a red line. So it is unclear, this is back to my article, by the way, it is unclear how long it would take to build deterrence force envisioned by Blinken. America's arms stockpiles are dwindling as Washington is attempting to transfer Kiev enough military equipment just to keep its army fighting. The U.S. is additionally has plans to significantly increase arms transfers to Taiwan. Blinken claimed in his speech, our support for Ukraine hasn't weakened our capabilities to meet potential threats from China or elsewhere. It has strengthened them. However, in November, the Wall Street Journal reported, this is a quote, the U.S. government and congressional officials fear the conflict in Ukraine is exacerbating a nearly $19 billion backlog of weapons bound for Taiwan, further delaying arms to the island. So kind of just one of the clear lies that Blinken told throughout this speech. Additionally, the White House may not have had the support it needs in the Capitol for such a massive military buildup in Ukraine. Blinken asserted, in America, this has bipartisan support. However, at the beginning of May, Representative Michael McCaul, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, he's a Republican from Texas, said future support for Ukraine would be contingent on success in Kiev's long-planned counteroffensive. Additionally, I think the American people are growing a little bit weary of this war. And so, particularly the Republican half of America, but still, that is a number of people, and the support isn't as deep as Blinken makes it out to me. Now, since McCall made that statement about Ukraine needing a successful counteroffensive, Ukraine has slowly lost more territory to Russian forces, including Bakhmut. Zelensky committed endless resources in a months-long battle for the city, despite the advice from his Western backers. The White House is now preparing for the counteroffensive to fail. So, Washington's strategy, as laid out by Blinken, calls for arming Ukraine and weakening Russia. Russia is significantly worse off today than it was before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, militarily, economically, and geopolitically, he said, adding, President Putin has diminished Russia's influence on every continent. However, General Christopher Cavoli, the commander of U.S. European Command, told Congress in April that Moscow's ground forces are bigger today than before Moscow launched its invasion of Ukraine. While the White House has attempted to isolate the Kremlin, Moscow has weathered Western sanctions by developing relationships in the global south. On Friday, Russian officials met with prospective members of the BRICS coalition, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE. In September, Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi said in a meeting with Putin, the relationship between countries that are sanctioned by the U.S., such as Iran, Russia, or other countries, can overcome many problems and issues and make them stronger. Blinken justified the Biden administration's commitment to a militaristic approach by claiming the White House attempted to gauge the Kremlin in meaningful diplomacy before the invasion of Ukraine. And this is a statement from Blinken during his speech. President Biden told President Putin that we were prepared to discuss our mutual security concerns, a message that I reaffirmed repeatedly, including in person with Foreign Minister Lavrov. We offered written proposals to reduce tensions together with our allies and partners. We use every form to try to prevent war, from NATO-Russia Council to the OSCE, from the UN to our direct channels. However, in April 2022, the Biden administration official Derek Chollet admitted that the White House refused to negotiate with the Kremlin on Putin's core concern, Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. We made clear to the Russians that we are willing to talk to them on issues that we thought were genuine concerns, Chollet said, adding that the administration didn't think that the future of Ukraine was one of those issues and that potential NATO membership was a non-issue. And so how you can misunderstand another country when they have been so clear about it, and when you have William Burns as the CIA director, a man who wrote a memo in 2008 and said that Ukrainian membership into the NATO alliance is a red line for everybody in Moscow, not Putin, not the Hots, but everyone. So quite striking. Anyways, let's move on here. I think I have one more story on the war in Ukraine today, and that is SpaceX lands Pentagon contract for Starlink terminals for Ukraine. The Pentagon Thursday said it awarded a contract to Elon Musk's SpaceX for Starlink satellite internet terminals to Ukraine. Satellite communications constitute a vital layer in Ukraine's overall communication networks, and the department contracts with Starlinks for services of this type. The Pentagon refused to share any details about the contract, and it's not clear how many terminals will be purchased. For operational security reasons and due to the critical nature of these systems, we do not have additional information regarding specific capabilities, contracts, or partners at this time. I think this is important. We have to know if the Pentagon is especially overpaying SpaceX, because that's owned by Elon Musk, and Elon Musk owns one of the most important communication platforms in the U.S. If they're paying him triple for SpaceX, don't you think maybe they're trying to pay him off for something else? All right, so this is an update to an article I talked about on the show maybe last Monday. The State Department said Wednesday that the shipment of U.S.-made Stinger anti-aircraft missiles that arrived in Taiwan last week was a part of a $223.56 million arms sales to Taipei that was approved in 2019. The Taiwanese media report that the Stinger shipment was a part of a new $500 million military aid package that the U.S. has been preparing to send Taiwan, but the State Department spokesperson told The Hill that that wasn't true. The case predates authorities, including in the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act, the spokesperson said, referring to the 2023 National Defense Authorization that included unprecedented military aid for Taiwan. The NDAA included $1 billion in aid for Taiwan under the Presidential Drawdown Authority, the primary way the U.S. has been arming Ukraine. The PDA allows the Biden administration to ship weapons directly from American stockpiles. So, Stinger missiles still going to Taiwan, just again there by a slightly different payment mechanism. U.S. and Taiwan signed first trade agreement under new initiative, angering China. And this is to be expected anytime the U.S. does anything with Taiwan that it would do with an independent nation. Beijing is going to see that as Washington asserting Taipei's independence, and rightfully so. If Hawaii was having an issue with the U.S. or something like that, and they signed a trade agreement with China that went against American policy, American sanctions or something like that, that would obviously be seen by Washington as China recognizing Hawaii as an independent country and not a part of the United States. And we just had the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, lie through his teeth to the press to tell them that the Biden administration has not abandoned the one China policy, when clearly they have, because they're signing these trade agreements with Taiwan. But they're just going to continue to say, no, that's still in place. The reporter even asked Sullivan a couple times, like, it seems like Biden saying that we're going to defend Taiwan means that the one China policy isn't in place. And Sullivan just kept doubling down and saying, no, it is. It hasn't changed. And so it's very Orwellian. All right, next up here, China Defense Minister says U.S.-China war would be unbearable disaster. He made this statement during a speech in Singapore, and he said it is undeniable that a severe conflict or confrontation between China and the U.S. will be an unbearable disaster for the world. He delivered the warning while calling for more dialogue between the U.S. and China, saying the two nations should seek common ground and on common interests to grow bilateral ties and deepen cooperation. China declined to hold a meeting between the defense ministers, that's U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, because the U.S. have sanctions on the Chinese defense minister. And we've talked about that on the show recently, so I'm not going to go into that too much today. So we have these two stories from the past week. U.S. accuses Chinese jet of unprofessional intercept over South China Sea. And then this one, U.S. accuses Chinese warship of unsafe maneuver in the Taiwan Strait. And I think this is China looking to combat the U.S. growing militarism in the region. I was wondering how long it would take before China started to interfere with U.S. warships around Taiwan. And it appears that we had that happen earlier this week. So this from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. U.S. Indo-Pacific Command accused Chinese warship of acting in an unsafe manner when it passed a U.S. Navy guided missile destroyer that was transiting the Taiwan Strait with a Canadian frigate on Saturday. The command said in a statement that the Chinese warship overtook the USS Chonghoon in the Taiwan Strait and passed within 150 yards of its bow. The statement said the Chonghoon had to slow its speed to 10 knots, 10 nautical miles per hour. The U.S. military frames the Taiwan Strait transits as routine, but Beijing views them as provocations because Taiwan isn't very far off of the Chinese mainland, right? And so if Taiwan is a part of China, then American warships should be sailing through the Taiwan Strait every time the U.S. sails a warship through the Taiwan Strait in Beijing's eyes. And I think in reality, it asserts Taiwanese independence. And so I think we're going to see more of this to come. All right, next up here. Iran says it will form naval alliance with Gulf Arab states. And this comes after I wrote an article last week for the Libertarian Institute, basically talking about how the UAE had pulled out of a U.S. coalition that was carrying out patrols in the region. I thought that was kind of interesting, especially as the UAE is apparently one of the states that Iran is looking at forming this new bloc with. So very good article here by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Not sure if anything will come out of it yet, but it would be interesting to see that the Gulf countries form their own coalition and take care of their own security needs rather than, having the U.S. design and control those systems, of course, because in Washington, there's so much hatred for Tehran. Those coalitions just kind of morph into anti-Iranian institutions. All right, here we go. Last article today. U.S. launches second airstrike in Somalia within a week. AFRICOM, that's a U.S. Africa Command, announced that it launched an airstrike in Somalia on June 1st, marking the second U.S. bombing in the country within a week and the third since May 20th. AFRICOM said the strike was launched about 37 miles southwest of Kismayo, a port city in southern Somalia. The command claimed the strike killed 3 al-Shabaab fighters, and that's its initial assessment, and found that no civilians were harmed, but the Pentagon is notorious for undercounting civilian casualties. This is particularly true in Somalia. Countless times, dozens of times since I have been doing this show, has there been a case where AFRICOM comes out and they says, we carried out an airstrike in Somalia, we killed 7 al-Shabaab, we killed 12 al-Shabaab, we killed 4 al-Shabaab, whatever the number is. And when you know it, a couple days later or a couple months later, when a journalist finally gets to Somalia, they go to the village and they say, the U.S. carried out an airstrike here. What happened? And they say, oh yeah, well, there was, 3 men in that car. One of them was 60 years old and walked with a cane. He was a grandfather, and the other 2 were school-aged children. So no, they weren't members of al-Shabaab. So the last U.S. airstrike was launched on May 26th, and it came after al-Shabaab attacked an African Union base that was housing Ugandan troops. Uganda says on Saturday that 54 of its soldiers were killed in the attack. The U.S. said the airstrike destroyed military equipment that al-Shabaab took from the base. And so they probably had some American weapons. That also probably means that the U.S. didn't get all of them. And so more airstrikes are likely coming to Somalia, a country that has absolutely been devastated by the United States. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you can, share out the show, recommend it to somebody, do what you can to help this show grow its presence. Whenever you do, we really appreciate it here. We'll continue to, try to put out great content, 3 shows a week. Hope everybody's enjoying it, and any feedback you have, I always appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.